Okay, Friday evening. This is video 3. Again, we're going to do it in one take, ideally under 15 minutes. And here's where it gets interesting. Please, though, don't jump in and watch this video before you've watched videos number 1, which is about 10 minutes, and number 2, which I think is 14 minutes. We're building on some of the tools and theory that has been unpacked in those first 2 videos, as well as exploring some of the tensions that we're beginning to understand coming out of coronavirus, COVID-19 stories and environmental stories. And this is where we begin to apply what we've unpacked in videos 1 and 2. Again, Guy, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So we've introduced 5 steps and want to keep these 2 the focus, because if we're asking ourselves, the only thing that can replace a story is a better story. So what is that better story? Actually, we have to ask ourselves another question first, which is we need to know what stories people are already telling themselves about COVID-19. And we need to know the general public, corporations, governments. And the key thing for that is because they're the ones that are holding narratives. They're the ones that are kind of creating the narratives. So if we've got hope for kind of changing them, we've got to understand those stories. And we're starting to see these kind of shift already. And very much there's an emergent narrative around listen to the experts and we'll get back to normal as quick as possible. And for a lot of us, that's not necessarily the outcome that we're looking for. So having identified some of the kind of key stakeholders and started to look at the stories that they're telling themselves through the lens of the canvas, we've been able to build up what we're kind of calling a universal COVID-19 story. So this is a snapshot in time at the moment. And to sort of run through the everyday heroes of that story are the citizens and communities that are playing ball. They're resilient, they're compliant, but they're feeling vulnerable. The villain, as we know, is the kind of super infectious, malicious, an immediate, invisible killer. The call to adventure and the crossing the threshold is now shifted. So combined, they can be simply summed up as we'll beat it together with social isolation. The mentors, where we've had an elevation of science and the expertise, and in particular, those people that are in the phase ahead of us. Allies and their kind of gifts, well, the kind of frontline workers really kind of fall in here. So the health services, teachers, supermarkets. The challenges, first and foremost, is really clear: to protect lives, save lives. Also, the stimulus packages, protecting jobs, protecting homes, business. So you can kind of see moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And now starting to be talked about the kind of challenge about how we kind of get through this, but also sort of post-surge start to kind of exit lockdown. But to highlight again, this idea of a better world is actually about life going back to normal as quickly as possible with as many lives saved. So as storytellers, the things that sort of jump out to us are around the everyday hero and the sort of liminal state that they're in, the role of the immediacy that the villain is kind of playing in terms of making people change their behavior dramatically. But this idea about getting back to life, getting life back to normal as quickly as possible. And in terms of sort of where we kind of sort of see this story, we know where we are in terms of like 3 phases, kind of pre-surge, surge and post-surge. And so we're sort of seeing ourselves at the kind of low foothills. And to use the 3 horizons framework, this story was sort of still squarely at sort of stage 1. We're in the middle, and actually this story could go off in either of the 3 directions. So it could go in the way that we want to, in terms of transformation, but also it could be the start of a series of stories and kind of narratives that kind of stick us back down in business as usual. So we talked about quite a few different stakeholders, but we didn't talk about the environmental movement. But we also need to know what story they are telling themselves right now, COVID-19. And it's a slightly different story because, yes, the heroes are the people that are fixing and replacing broken systems. The ordinary world is that collapse through biodiversity and climate breakdown is the biggest threat to humanity, and there's a kind of a lack of change there. The villain is around our selfishness. Yet again, messing around with nature, we've triggered another invisible killer. Our call to adventure is that now is the time for a transformation, because there's a sustainable future post-pandemic that we can kind of see, and that's what we all want to mobilize ourselves towards. It works for us, the elevation in status of science and expertise, the thought and the kind of leadership in terms of thought and actions is kind of key for allies backing this up. People talking about emissions, for example. Still about protecting lives and saving lives, of course it is, and especially the vulnerable in the kind of global south, but also sort of thinking about how do we inspire new thinking, how do we mobilize new action. And the sort of stark difference is actually the better world. It's kind of the point we want to get to is not returning to where we were before, but actually it's about having new systems. It's about new values underpinning those systems that basically support planet and human health in harmony. And there are elements to this story that you can see that don't work, that don't work. So some of those, the biggest threat to humanity, that message is now clearly not going to cut through for a huge group of stakeholders to be saying, well, it's not climate because the immediacy in front of us is this virus. Again, sort of things that rely on using the selfishness of humanity as a villain, as a kind of a behavior that needs to be defeated as the inner emotional journey, are not going to work, because it is our selflessness and working together as a community that is the way that we're going to defeat the virus. And again, sort of not returning to before, it is a message that people don't want to hear. They're looking for kind of safe ground, and safe ground is behind them, not in front of them. However, within the same story, there are some really interesting elements that we can use that will be really powerful for a kind of a new story. So some of the things around lack of change, lack of speed, scope and scale, well, actually, now is the time that we're going to see that happen, that it's going to be materially impactful, the ability for us to work together in coalitions and collaborations and make change happen. That the influence of scientists and experts is really key. There's a different set of allies that perhaps we don't rely on, but actually how do we work a little bit more closely with the innovators who are going to be bringing some of the alternatives to life? How are we going to be able to work with the key workers who clearly are going to be thinking about broken systems and kind of fixing them and wanting to seize that opportunity? And the idea about sort of new systems for planet and human health, well, that is very positive. So there are ways where we can start to kind of demonstrate that. We'll kind of come on to how that works in story terms. But at this stage, having looked at those sort of two different stakeholders, I think it's clear, and the point we want to make is that the environment COVID-19 story is not a better story. So if we're looking for a better story, the one that we've got is not it. And worse than that, if we're looking for many better stories to change a narrative, there are now thousands of better stories for the stakeholders that we want to influence, but they're the wrong ones. They're pulling in the opposite direction. And that's a huge danger at the moment. So we're sort of at a kind of a story crucible, really, where we can go one of kind of several ways. And so getting the story right is really, really important. So in summary, some of the things that we can learn from about what we do need to do, well, we need to avoid talking about the biggest threat to humanity for the moment. We need to, think carefully about civil disobedience when actually we're making change through civil obedience. And we need to kind of avoid not, talking about not going back to normal, because for lots of people, that's exactly where they want to go. We also need to be thinking sort of post-surge around telling a better story, given that stakeholders that we want to kind of connect with are going to be exhausted. There's going to be a bit of sort of change fatigue there. What we do need to do is show a very visible role that the environment movement has played in rebuilding lives. And again, this idea about working with the innovators and the kind of key workers, so a different set of heroes for our story. And there are things that we can kind of do. So we can start focusing on the tangible transformations that will be happening today. So things that are making a difference, that are healthy for the planet and healthy for kind of humans. We can focus on the elevation of sort of science and expertise as status and kind of influence within the media, within policy decision making. The stories of cooperation and mobilization, the fact that we are working well together, it is absolutely critical. And again, this idea about the kind of connection between healthy values and kind of systems without necessarily drilling hard into biodiversity and the kind of natural world. And you could start to sort of see where this sort of second set of stories can sort of play out as we sort of kind of move into Surge, and that there are technologies that are being deployed. People are sharing data, they are sharing know-how, and starting to find innovative solutions. And so the idea of this sort of wave of stories, if you like, is that it's going to shift us away from business as usual. There's still two different directions we could go at, but we're starting to kind of move up towards two different possible horizons and kind of away from the one that we're seeking to avoid. The real key thing, though, is what comes next, because we're going to sort of hit a kind of crossroads. And so the really important story is the story of financial stimulus, and the master story of that is potentially the UNDP facility story. Because that is going to drive a lot of the stories that sit beneath it through this kind of surge period and kind of into kind of post-surge as we look to kind of respond and recover. And so that story at the moment is blank. You know, it's yet to be kind of created. That is the huge opportunity that I think we all recognize exists. And that will be the sort of subject of the fourth webinar or video rather that we're going to deliver for you. So thank you.
Wow, thanks, Guy. That's a trail into video 4 if ever I've seen one. So there's the challenge, the paradox or contradiction that we it literally in a few hours over the course of this week have been starting to unpack. And the big question, I guess, that we want to dig into in part on Monday is what we might do to resolve this contradiction. And to paraphrase from the head of the World Health Organization, part of it is going to be to test, but stories rather than for viral infection. Friday evening, once again, just a few minutes earlier than the last one. I hope this is useful for you guys. We're around over the weekend. If you want to talk, just reach out to me. We can loop Guy in if needed. Next up over the weekend, we're going to knuckle down and unpack what we see as the facility of the story. Sorry, the story of the facility. It's been another long day. I'm sure it has for you guys as well. Good afternoon to everybody in New York and good evening here. We'll raise a glass to you all later. Thanks very much.